This is the first installment of the fall series in what we call the Discover Auburn lecture series. This is jointly sponsored by the Auburn University Libraries, by the Carolyn Marshall Draughon Center for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts, and also by the AU Bookstore. We have, I think, 4 lectures scheduled for this fall. You have a card regarding the next one there in your seat. There's one later this semester by Lynn Williams, who recently retired from the library faculty. It'll be about Southern printmakers, and it'll also involve a book signing. And Joyce, the other one, I hope is slipping my mind. Oh, Dr. Mullen, Gary Mullen, who is writing a biography of Philip Henry Goss, who was a British naturalist who visited Alabama during the 1830s and drew pictures of Alabama insects, particularly butterflies. Some of Goss's drawings are hanging in the atrium out here. But I'm Dwayne Cox, and welcome to the library. There are copies of the book for purchase up here. I'm sure the author will be glad to sign them. There will be refreshments afterwards in the room behind the reference desk. So that leaves me only to introduce the speaker, who many of you know already, Mike Jernigan. Mike is an Auburn graduate. He has a bachelor's degree, I thought in history, but he tells me in English from Auburn. Bert, what kind of student was Mike? Was he any good? And then he got his master's degree in history from Auburn, but we know Mike best, or at least I know Mike best, for his accomplishments as the editor of, or as a writer first for the old Alumni News. He worked with Kay Lovern. Many of you knew Kay. And then Mike was the founding editor of the Auburn magazine, and was the editor who instituted the what I think is the beautiful format that it still has today. And Mike was a delight to work with for me as editor of the Auburn magazine. I could call him and say, hey, we really have something good that your readers would be interested in. And I would tell him what it was. And if he thought it was stupid, he would tell me. If he thought it was a good idea, he would tell me. And then he frequently would call and say, would you do something on this or would you do something on that? And they were always good ideas, and we had a great working relationship there with the Auburn magazine. Mike is retired from Auburn now, although he's not completely retired. He's on the faculty at Lee Scott right at the moment, and as I understand it, he teaches international politics or international relations, which he's had, of course, some experience with local campus politics, and I'm sure he's able to relate that to international politics. So without further ado, Mike Jernigan.
I probably will, if everybody can hear me, I probably won't stay put. I do better when I pace, when I talk. Those of you who knew me a while back knew that I really avoided public speaking at every opportunity. I was not a person who liked to get up in front of a crowd, but after I retired, I found out that in order to make a living, you have to do some things you might not want to do. I want to talk a little bit today about George Petrie, who is really a treasure, and I don't think that Auburn people have ever really realized what an amazing man George Petrie was. It's a little unfortunate, really, that he has gotten the credit for writing the Auburn Creed and being the first Auburn football coach, because that really overshadowed many of his other amazing accomplishments. He was truly a Renaissance man, a generalist, and it would be impossible for one person to do the things that George Petrie did today in this age of specialization. Petrie was born in Montgomery in 1866, and his father was a Presbyterian minister. His grandfather was also a Presbyterian minister, and his father was a Confederate veteran, and that was very important in his life. As a boy, his father traveled around quite a bit, working as a preacher in different places, and he actually spent a little bit of time one summer in Auburn. It was his first exposure to the university. His father later took a job in Greenville and then went on to Charlottesville, Virginia when Petrie was a teenager. And of course, Petrie went along with him. He was a good student, and he had the opportunity, because they lived in Charlottesville, to attend the University of Virginia, which was one of the top colleges in the South then, just like it is today. So Petrie ended up being a proud alumnus of the University of Virginia, which had implications for Auburn later on. When he came out of school, because of his previous connections in Auburn, he knew some people in town. Dr. William Leroy Brune, who was the Auburn president, offered him a job to bring him back to Auburn. He knew that he was a promising scholar. He had earned his master's degree at Virginia, and so Brune offered him a position on the faculty at the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Alabama, which was what Auburn was known as at the time. Petrie came back to Auburn, though, to teach Latin and Greek. He was not a history teacher. And those of you who know Petrie, he really became famous later on as the founder of the history department at Auburn, but he originally hated history. He did not like to teach history, and he only agreed to teach history reluctantly when he came to Auburn in 1887. When he took the job at Auburn, between the time he took the job and he came to Auburn from Charlottesville, Old Main, which was the main building and really one of only two buildings of any substance on the Auburn campus at that time, Old Main burned down. And when news arrived in Charlottesville that Old Main had been destroyed by fire, for a while Petrie didn't know if he even had a job. But he came down anyway, and he had to conduct his first classes in some temporary facilities. Langdon Hall was used as classrooms, and some wooden buildings that were unheated were put up, and that's where he taught his first classes in Latin and Greek, and reluctantly those history classes. He really never intended to stay at Auburn, though. When he came to Auburn in 1887, he was only coming to Auburn long enough to earn enough money to go to Germany and study and get a doctorate. Because at the time, most intellectuals, many U.S. intellectuals wanted to study in Germany because the modern research university was really just having its beginnings in Germany. So Petrie's intention was to earn just enough money to go to Europe and continue his studies. Auburn salaries then were much like Auburn salaries now, and it didn't work out that way. He stayed at Auburn for 2 years, realized that there was no way that he could afford to go to Europe, but decided instead to go to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Johns Hopkins at that time was a fairly new university that had been founded on the German model, and many of the professors had come from Germany, many of the administrators, so they were very familiar with the research university model. And so Petrie went to Baltimore, quit his job at Auburn, intending never to come back, left and went to Baltimore to get his doctorate. When he went to get that doctorate, he would become the first Alabamian to get that degree. He was the first Alabamian ever to earn a doctorate, and the first Auburn faculty member to ever hold an earned doctorate. When he came back, when he graduated from Johns Hopkins, Brune was waiting. Brune knew what a promising scholar Petrie was. Now he had a doctorate in hand, So Broome made him an offer that he couldn't refuse and brought him back to Auburn. But he came back to Auburn a changed man. While he was at Johns Hopkins, he studied under a historian named Herbert Baxter Adams, who was leading the way in a new way to study history, which was based on original documentary sources, writing original history based on original documents. Petrie was studying languages at Johns Hopkins, of course, because that was his interest, but he decided to take one class under Herbert Baxter Adams, a seminar, history seminar, and he was hooked. Adams really brought the study of history alive for Petrie, and he became an enthusiastic proponent of the documentary style of teaching history. So while he was there, though, he also had another professor who would have a major impact on him and on Auburn, and that was a professor that was teaching during the summer at Johns Hopkins named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, of course, would later become president of the United States, but at this time, Wilson was the president at Princeton, and he had also coached the Princeton football team in 1890. Petrie had first, it's very likely that Petrie had first seen football played at the University of Virginia, an early form of football played at the University of Virginia, but he had no interest. But while he was at Auburn for his first day, he had been put in charge of physical education activities for the Auburn students. So he was looking for things to have them do in his future teaching positions when he came into Woodrow Wilson's class, and Woodrow Wilson regaled his students with stories about football and his coaching at Princeton and his coaching at Creighton. And he was a football expert, and he got Petrie hooked on the new game, still relatively new game of football. So when Petrie returned to Auburn in 1891, he brought football back with him. For the bad or the good. I don't know how you feel about that, but he brought football back with him. When he arrived back, Broome lured him back to Auburn in 1891. The first thing he did, though, was he built a gymnasium. He and the university carpenter got up in the attic in Sanford Hall and built a gymnasium that the students and the faculty could use. And that was his first steps toward physical activity for the students, but he really had bigger plans. By 1891, he had a football team assembled that included several faculty members along with students. And the biggest player on that team, in fact, was a faculty member named McKissick, who was an engineering professor, and he topped out a little over 200 pounds. He was the center on that football team and by far the largest player. He was considered a giant at that time at a little over 200 pounds. Now he probably couldn't play quarterback. But then he was quite a large and quite fearsome character. Another faculty member on that team was named Varnel. Varnel was the kicker and went on to a long career at the University of Alabama and later played a prominent role in later incidents in Petrie's life. But by 1892, football began to dominate a lot of Petrie's time. 1892, in the book, the chapter on 1892 is called A Year Like No Other, and it truly was a year like no other. So many things happened for Petrie and for Auburn during that year that there's probably never been another year where so many major events with so much impact took place. Petrie had his team practicing by 1891, but by January of 1892, the Auburn football team was ready to hit somebody else. And an Auburn graduate named John Kimball, who had graduated in the spring of '91 and had played on Petrie's first football teams, had practiced with those teams, had gone on to the University of Georgia to study law. John Kimball is actually an unsung hero in arranging the first Auburn-Georgia football game. Usually credit for that is given to Charles Hurdy, who was a professor at the University of Georgia. Purdy did have quite a bit to do with it, but as far as handling many of the practical aspects of arranging that first contest between Auburn and Georgia, John Kimball was instrumental in doing that. And that role that he had in that has sort of been lost to history, but luckily came back out through the documents and the research. Kimball invited Petrie to come to Athens to referee the first Georgia football game, which was actually against Mercer in January of 1892. Georgia had started playing football about the same time, practicing football about the same time as Auburn, and Charles Hurdy had also attended Johns Hopkins, although there's no clear evidence that Hurdy ever attended Woodrow Wilson's seminars. He was very much the athlete and had picked up football and interest in football while he was at Johns Hopkins as well. But Kimball invited Petrie to come to Athens and referee the first game between Georgia and Mercer. Petrie was unable to do that, but he saw an opportunity. He wasn't going to miss a scouting chance, so he sent the Auburn quarterback over to help referee that first contest between Georgia and Mercer in January of 92. Frank Lupton was the quarterback's name that went over and did the scouting report. Georgia won that first game against Mercer 50-0. Mercer had never played a football game, had never practiced at all, and so it wasn't a real surprise that they didn't fare very well. But they lost 50-0, and the Atlanta Constitution's report of the game noted that it would have been worse, but the referee left before the game was over and missed 2 touchdowns because the liquor store was going to close, and he needed to go before the liquor store closed and pick up something to take home. So he was gone when Georgia scored their last 2 touchdowns. So the official score was 50-0. Lupton came back to Auburn with the report about the Georgia team, and Petrie immediately saw the opportunity that maybe we can take these guys. So Petrie challenged Georgia to a game, and of course Hurdy accepted, and they started making arrangements to play in Atlanta in February of 1892. They couldn't find a sponsor. They needed a sponsor. They had no money. There was no athletic budget. So they were searching Atlanta for a sponsor. Piedmont Park is where they played that first game, but Piedmont Park didn't want to take a risk, a financial risk on a football game, so Piedmont Park turned them down as far as being a sponsorship and wouldn't even give them a cut rate to use the field. But the Atlanta Constitution saw an opportunity to push subscriptions and circulation, and so the Atlanta Constitution agreed to sponsor that first game. And they began to publicize the game and put out information about the game. And the editor of the Atlanta Constitution wired Petrie urgently as he prepared to do the first article and said, "What are your colors?" Well, Auburn had no colors. They had never had an athletic team, and so they really had no colors to use. And so Petrie, though, had already had an idea. Being a loyal alumnus of the University of Virginia, he knew that he wanted to use the orange and blue that the University of Virginia had introduced 4 years earlier. And so that is where Auburn's colors came from. Virginia had gotten those colors in an informal student meeting from a student who had attended an event in England at Oxford and came in wearing an orange and blue scarf during a meeting where Virginia students were trying to decide what their colors were going to be. And they couldn't agree, and when the student came in with the scarf on, they knew they had found their color. So they went to the orange and blue, and then Petrie borrowed those same colors for Auburn, and that is how Auburn's colors became orange and blue, the same orange and blue as Virginia. Let me get a little bit of water here. Pause for a second. Working without a microphone has its hazards. Auburn put together that team and went over to play Georgia in February of 1892 on a day where the weather was in the 50s. It was raining. It was less than an auspicious day for the first football game, but Auburn went over on a special train and met the Georgia team at the old Kimball Hotel and had lunch before the game with the Georgia team and the Georgia fans, and then everyone went out to Piedmont Park and played the game. Football was a little different in 1892 than it is today in a lot of ways. But the field was 110 yards long. When a man was tackled, he wasn't down until he said so. So people could pile on him and beat him and kick him, and unless he surrendered, he could keep crawling toward the goal, and often did. It was a very rough, there was no equipment, no kind of protective equipment at all, so it could be a very hazardous game. But luckily, Auburn survived all of those things and won that first game 10-0. And the only Auburn touchdown that day was scored by the fullback. His name was Rufus Dorsey, who was a native Atlantan. So the first Auburn touchdown was scored by a Georgian, which is probably the first piece of the long and special relationship between Auburn and Georgia. Auburn won that first game 10-0 and came back to Auburn to a fairly triumphal greeting in the town, and suddenly football fever swept the entire state of Alabama. Before the game, Petrie had asked the Montgomery Advertiser to send a reporter to cover the game, and the advertiser had said, "No, we really don't have anybody. We're covering the gubernatorial canvass. We really can't spare anybody, but we'll send somebody, an amateur, along." It wasn't even important enough to require a reporter to go on the trip. But when Petrie and the team came back and they had won that first game, suddenly football became almost overnight very, very important in Alabama. Alabama had still not really recovered from Reconstruction, had not had a lot to be cheered about in many, many years. And so the idea that Alabama had beaten somebody at something was so impressive that everybody embraced that. And so suddenly football became very popular, and Petrie found himself as something of a celebrity, and the team and alumni were sending telegrams from all over the country thanking the team for their good work. Almost immediately after that game, Georgia started plotting its revenge. They wanted another match, but this time they wanted to play baseball, which they were much better at, and it had a team longer that had competed against other intercollegiate teams longer than Auburn. Auburn had never played at this point an intercollegiate baseball game. Baseball had been played on campus since just after the Civil War, but Auburn had never played against another college opponent, so Georgia saw an opportunity of their own. And John Kimball, once again, who knew the weaknesses of the Auburn baseball team and was playing on the Georgia baseball team, started goading Petrie and his former student colleagues at Auburn to play baseball. I should have mentioned before, on that first team, on the Georgia team, John Kimball played for Georgia. The Auburn graduate of the class of '91 who had learned to play football at Auburn was on that first Georgia team. He played for Georgia. He also was a baseball player along with Charles Hurdy, and he began to pester Petrie about playing baseball. Petrie was still sort of enjoying that first big football win, and he really didn't want to stick his neck out and take a chance of losing a baseball game, so he reluctantly agreed finally in the summer of 1892 to take on Georgia in baseball. He put together a team after going out and watching the kids play on campus. He put together a team that was his best effort. He also practiced with that team. And they went to Montgomery in the summer of 1892 to play Auburn's first intercollegiate baseball game, just a few months after they had played that first football game. they didn't fare nearly as well. They lost the baseball game 13-3 to Georgia in Montgomery's Riverside Park, which is long gone now, but that's where that first baseball game was played. They may have lost that game because of the fact that they wore yellow and blue that day. They could not afford uniforms. The football uniforms had been totally demolished in the football game. So all that was left was a few pairs of navy socks and some football pants, but nothing else was left. So in desperation, they found a vendor who was willing to sell them a number of yellow shirts for 60 cents, and they bought a quantity of those yellow shirts, and that's what they wore the day they played Georgia. It was yellow and blue. It's probably the only time that Auburn has ever worn yellow and blue. And it didn't help them too much. So they lost that baseball game 13-3. It was truly amazing the effect that losing had on Petrie. I was surprised as I did the research because almost immediately he started recruiting. Recruiting dates back to the very beginnings of football, college football, and Petrie immediately started recruiting baseball and football players to Auburn to improve those Auburn teams, which up until then had been made up just of students and faculty on campus. He located two brothers that had played at Troy at the Normal College and began recruiting them to play baseball at Auburn, and ended up spending almost $500 in scholarship funds and other funds to provide room and board for them while they were here, to get them up here to play baseball. You have to remember, though, at that time there was no NCAA, so there were no rules controlling recruiting, although some of the things that Petrie did then would probably be illegal today. But he did bring the Andrews brothers up here and spent $500 doing it. They never played a game. Just like now, sometimes the best recruits don't pan out. The Andrew brothers never played, but he also had his eye on three other football players. One of them was named George Shackleford. Shackleford had been a member of the Georgia team in that first Auburn-Georgia game, but after Georgia lost the football game, the Georgia Board of Trustees had banned the Georgia football team from going off campus again for a year. So Georgia was not able to play any more football in 1892. To Petrie, this made Shackleford a free agent. And he immediately got in touch with John Kimball and started asking John Kimball to bring George Shackleford to Auburn. The players had been very impressed with him in that first game, and they wanted him to come and play at Auburn. Another player that Petrie coveted was named J.V. Brown. J.V. Brown is a fairly famous Auburn football player and later became the athletic director at Auburn. But at this time, he had played on the team at Mercer. And he had been scouted by Frank Lupton when Mercer had lost to Georgia. Even though Mercer had not done very well that day, Lupton had seen some talent there. So Petrie went after J.V. Brown, who was the star player at Mercer. To do that, he had to be a little sneaky. So he used intermediaries to contact Brown and gauge his interest, and brought him to campus secretly to woo him, and burned up the telegraph lines between Auburn and Macon, trying to bring J.V. Brown to Auburn. And eventually he did. J.V. Brown would eventually come to Auburn, as did George Shackleford. Petrie eventually got both of his men. He was trying to prepare for yet another football game. A lot of people don't realize that Auburn actually played 4 football games in 1892, not just one. Against Georgia, they played 4. He was trying to recruit these players to get them on campus in time for the fall of 1892, when he planned to go to Atlanta and play 3 games in 4 days. He was so overconfident after his first win that he felt like they could go to Atlanta and play 3 games in 4 days. So he began to plan for that and to get in touch with the Constitution again, who agreed to sponsor these other games, a great Thanksgiving series in Atlanta in the fall of 1892. Something else was happening on campus in the fall of 1892, though, that was a little bit of a distraction for Petrie's players, and that was the first women had come to campus and enrolled in that same fall of 1892. That's another role that Petrie had that people really don't realize. Generally, women are recognized as having come to Auburn in the fall of 1892, but they had been on campus before that. In the summer of 1892, Petrie had held a summer school and had gotten Dr. Brune to agree to hold a summer school session if Petrie could make enough money to cover his costs. And Petrie had launched a summer school, and he had recruited women to attend summer school at Auburn in the summer of 1892. And several women had attended. Those were actually the first women to come to campus and study at Auburn, although officially women enrolled in the regular program in 1892, in the fall of 1892. Petrie remained instrumental throughout his life, an instrumental ally of the co-eds at Auburn. They were very fond of him. He was very close to many of them, helped them in their careers, just like he did his other students, and always George Petrie always held a special place in the co-ed's heart at Auburn. Once the hubbub died down of the arrival of women, though, Petrie got his team to get back and have their thoughts to football. He arranged to play, as I said earlier, he was a little overconfident after that first win. So he felt like that Auburn was ready to play some of the top schools in the South. He decided that Auburn could take on the likes of Duke, North Carolina, Virginia, teams that had been playing football for several years longer than Auburn. John Kimball tried to tell him at Georgia, John Kimball tried to tell him, that's not a good idea. You're not ready. Auburn is not ready to play those teams that have professional coaches and professional trainers, but Petrie would not be convinced. He set up these games, and Auburn traveled to Atlanta once again over the Thanksgiving week of 1892 to play Trinity, which of course later became Duke, North Carolina, and Georgia Tech were the three games that they were going to play. The campus was wild with confidence when Petrie and that team set off for Atlanta. They knew that they had the best team and the best coach, and everyone was very excited and sure that it was going to be another triumph for Auburn. It didn't turn out that way. Duke was the first opponent. Duke had a professional coach and athletes that had been specifically recruited for football, had weight trained, done all of those things, and Auburn got massacred, 34-6 in that first game. The bad thing, not only did they lose 34-6, they had to turn around and play again the very next day, and they were in no condition to do that. When news got back to the campus at Auburn about the score and how the game had turned out, the students refused to believe it. And they telegraphed Petrie and said, send us the real scoop, because this has got to be a mistake. But unfortunately, it was not a mistake. And they really found out the next day just how far they had to go. They played North Carolina the very next day. North Carolina was the champion of what would later become the Atlantic Coast Conference, was generally acknowledged to be the best team. Their players were giants compared to the Auburn players, and they had long hair. They wore their hair long in lieu of helmets to protect their heads, and so they had a very fearsome appearance. So the Auburn players were more than a little intimidated when they went out on the field to play North Carolina. But One of the Auburn players did note, "We've seen uglier men than this at home." Unfortunately, they did not. They played as well as they looked, and they won. North Carolina won that game 60-0. Auburn actually surrendered early in the second half when the score was 50-0 at the half. And early in the second half, after North Carolina scored 2 more touchdowns in about 5 minutes, Auburn threw in the towel. Said they'd had enough. Luckily, the final opponent of that Thanksgiving series turned out to be Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech was also fairly new to football, not very advanced, not as advanced as Auburn. And Auburn was able to save a little bit of their pride and beat Georgia Tech 26-0, so that they felt a little better about themselves. They came back to Auburn to find that they did not have the hero's welcome waiting that they had after that first game. In fact, the students were up in arms when Petrie and the team arrived back, so much so that the campus newspaper scolded the students for being so critical of the team and the coach. But Petrie really realized that the handwriting was on the wall, that they needed a professional coach and a professional team that was more recruited to play football, not a bunch of amateurs coached by a history professor. So Petrie really knew that his time was coming. He had one more contribution to make, though, to the early Auburn athletics, and that was to negotiate with the University of Alabama to arrange the first football game between Auburn and the university, which would be played in early 1893. Petrie negotiated the terms, worked with the city of Birmingham to set that game up. And interestingly, that game had almost been played. If Petrie had had his way, the first Auburn-Alabama game would have been played during the Thanksgiving week series in Atlanta. But Alabama was not able to make that date, and so they were not able to work out the details, and so that first game was put off and was later played in Birmingham. Petrie finalized the contracts and the arrangements for that Alabama game, but he would not coach it. He resigned shortly after that, right before the end of 1892. In December, he stepped down as the football coach, saying that it was time for a football coach that was specifically trained in the sport to take over. He knew that it was time for him to go. He also had his eyes on a young lady that he wanted to spend more time wooing, and that was Mary Lane, who was the daughter of General Lane, who was a mechanical engineering professor at Auburn. And Petrie really needed to devote more time to his love life and less time to his athletic pursuits. He also knew that the faculty at Auburn was losing patience with him spending so much of his time on the football team and with athletics. So then as now, not all faculty members are sports fans. And many of the faculty members felt like that the team leaving campus for football games and spending time practicing was a waste of time better spent on academics. So Petrie felt like it was also time for him to devote himself back to academics full time. So he stepped down. And that ended that amazing year of 1892. Auburn went on to beat Alabama in that first game in February of 1893 in Birmingham, but Petrie was not the coach. But he had laid the groundwork for that victory. So that was really his last contribution. 1892, though, ended with 4 football games, a baseball game, and women on campus. Athletics on a somewhat solid foundation, although not making money yet. And all of those contributions were due to George Petrie. So it truly was a year like no other. Petrie would spend another 50 years at Auburn after that, though, and contribute in many, many other ways. that's really all I have. I just wanted to talk about that one amazing year, unless you have any questions. Yeah.
Did he marry Miss Lane?
Mary Lane. He married Mary Lane in 1893. And she had a congenital heart defect and was unhealthy for most of her life. They had one child in 1901 who died at the age of 14 months. Yeah.
Did any faculty play on either the Thanksgiving trio or the subsequent Alabama game?
There were no faculty members on the team that played Alabama that I'm aware of. McKissick did play on the team that played in the Thanksgiving series against Trinity and Georgia Tech and Duke. McKissick was the engineering professor. Barnwell by then had left, and he was the only other faculty member, and he had left to go elsewhere.
Did he get the name of cue ball from his ball head or some other incident?
He did get the name of cue ball. He was prematurely bald. If any of you are familiar with George Petrie, he went bald in just after the turn of the century when he was still a relatively young man, and soon earned the name from the students, particularly the football players, of cue ball for his bald head. And there are many, many jokes in his correspondence where people made reference to his bald head, and students wrote him years later to remember things like, "I remember the day that a fly came down from the fan and landed on your bald dome and fell off because he wasn't wearing tennis shoes." So people wrote Petrie and ribbed him about that unmercifully for many, many years.
I had current events under Petrie. It was either in the fall of 1939 or 40 in Langdon Hall, a large class. It was a dynamic class, though.
Well, apparently he was an amazing professor, an amazing speaker. The praise for him from his former students was almost universal. And not only was he an amazing teacher, but he stayed involved with his students for years afterwards. Many of his students went on to become prominent historians themselves at Vanderbilt, University of Texas, LSU, just to name a few. He was probably at the height of his powers one of the 4 or 5 most recognized historians in the United States as far as the people that he corresponded with and had regular contact with. He was offered many, many other positions, presidencies on a number of occasions, faculty positions, higher department head positions at other places, but his first loyalty always was to his students at Auburn, and he remained at Auburn for another 50 years after the 1892, that amazing 1892 year.
When did he write the creed?
George Petrie wrote the creed, and actually the original creed still exists in his collection, where he hand wrote the Auburn Creed, and he wrote it in November of 1943 after he retired. Yet there's no story of why he did that. There's no good story about why he wrote the creed. He left no record behind of what prompted him to do that. There are a couple of stories that are related in the book that were secondhand stories that try to explain why he wrote the creed, but there's no documentary evidence to back either one of those stories up. One interesting thing about the original creed is the original copy of the creed that's in the Petrie collection does not include the last line, and because Auburn men and women believe in these things, I believe in Auburn and love it, was not in the original creed that George Petrie wrote. When the creed was published, he wrote it in November of 1943, and it was first published in the Auburn Plainsman in January of 1944. That line had been added. And we can only assume that George Petrie added that line, but we don't know when. Yes?
I wanted to ask if there was anyone else here besides Dr. Yeager who knew Dr. Petrie.
What can you tell us about him?
Well, my mother and Miss Catherine Wright used to go listen to current events in Langdon Hall every night when he had it.
Well, Petrie did teach a class in current events. He also did a radio broadcast of that same show, and even printed and it was reprinted as a column in the Montgomery Advertiser. His current events class was probably the most well-known single class in Auburn history, and was attended by not just students but townspeople who came to hear him talk about world events, and up until quite near his retirement, he continued to do that. Yeah.
My mother said she was a member of the 20th Century Study Club in Opelika, and he was the program one day and took all of them up to Horseshoe Bend and told them all about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
Well, he was actually, George Petrie was very knowledgeable about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and when the federal government set someone down to study the application of Horseshoe Bend for park status, George Petrie actually drove them up to Dadeville and toured the park with them, and was instrumental in Horseshoe Bend getting park status. He was involved with that. Yeah.
Are there any recordings of Petrie speaking and maybe delivering a class or a lecture?
I was unable to find any recordings of George Petrie's voice. If there were any that existed, they've either been lost or there's no record of where they are. He did do a radio broadcast. It was broadcast across the state based on his current events classes, but if any of those broadcasts were preserved, there's no record of it.
Where did you find the source material for your book?
That's a commercial for Dwayne, the source material, and that was really George Petrie's last great gift to Auburn that was not realized until many, many years until now. He left behind 29 boxes of material that spanned his entire career and life. And you got to remember that I said he was trained as a documentary historian. He was one of the first, and so he realized the value of original documents, and he made sure that those original documents were preserved and left in the proper place in special collections and archives, so that one day that they would be a tremendous source of Auburn history. So really, that was Petrie's last great gift to Auburn. Just another gift that he left to the university. Yeah.
So, why did he become so loyal to Auburn?
I don't know that he started out being loyal to Auburn per se. He, like I said originally, he planned to leave. He had no intent of staying. On a number of occasions during his career, he looked at going elsewhere, including one fairly serious flirtation with Tulane. But I think that his first loyalty, at least in the early years, was to his students, and they were involved in research, and he felt he didn't need to go off and leave them in the process, ruin or disrupt their research. And so his loyalty first was to his students, and I think that also had a lot to do with the fact that he never sought to advance himself to the presidency or any other position that he was sometimes suggested for. He was not interested in doing that. He hated even being a dean. He did become the dean of the graduate school, but he hated it because he hated the administration that was involved with it, the paperwork. He much preferred to be in the classroom or working with his students. So his loyalty was first to his students, but I think over the years it grew also to encompass Auburn. One interesting fact that comes out, because of that question, the rivalry between Auburn and the University of Alabama also goes back very, very far. And Petrie was involved in that to some extent. The University of Alabama always had a great interest in ending what was in effect the liberal arts program or the general studies program at Auburn. And wanted to eliminate that program. They schemed and plotted to do that in a number of ways over the years, and it always failed. But they finally, in 1913, targeted Petrie as the heart and soul of the liberal arts or the general studies program at Auburn. And they decided, President George Denny had recently come to Alabama, to the University of Alabama as president. He knew the Petrie family and knew Petrie personally, and they decided, the University of Alabama decided that they were going to recruit Petrie to Alabama, and if they could do that, and Petrie's departure would basically take the heart and soul out of the general studies program at Auburn, and it would gradually wither on the vine. They had another secret weapon that helped with that. You remember C.H. Barnwell, who had played on Petrie's first football team, by then was a dean at the University of Alabama. He was a close friend of Petrie's, and Denny and Petrie put a Denny and Barnwell put a full court press on Petrie to get him to come to the University of Alabama and give up his position at Auburn. He declined. And when he declined, they even used some tactics that were very questionable, attributing some statements to the Auburn president that he did not make. So they played dirty even then. But Petrie refused, turned down that opportunity to go to the University of Alabama, and Auburn continued to develop. As the University of Alabama, the letter to Petrie said, Auburn developed along its own peculiar course. So Petrie remained at Auburn, and the liberal arts tradition at Auburn was preserved. Yeah.
Well, at the very beginning of his career, when Brune was engaged in the battle with the trustees over liberal arts at Auburn to begin with, was Petrie involved in that, or did he step out and go to Hopkins when that battle was being played out, right at the very beginning of his career?
Petrie was at that time a very junior faculty member, but Brune was the struggle between liberal arts and agriculture goes way back at Auburn, and that's one of the things that was amazing about this was how much history repeated itself. Brune was a proponent of course, having a strong agricultural and mechanical element, but he also felt that a college should have a balance, and that was his reason for recruiting a faculty member like Petrie to Auburn, because it gave him something of an ace in the hole and a very strong faculty member in the liberal arts or the general studies. That was the reason why he created, I think, a position for Petrie when he graduated from Johns Hopkins with a doctorate. He wanted to lay that argument to rest, and he brought Petrie back as the only faculty member with a doctorate, which of course gave him a tremendous standing and prestige on the faculty, and it was difficult for his critics then to attack the general studies and liberal arts. So I think Brune used Petrie in part to help his campaign to resist those proponents of Auburn going to the strict agricultural and mechanical model. Yes?
You mentioned that Petrie wanted to study in Germany
Yes.
in his early years, and I'm just wondering if later on he ever arranged for study abroad for his students, that kind of thing.
He did not. He did not. And of course, he never made it to Germany. Interestingly, Charles Hurdy at the University of Georgia had the same goal. He wanted to study in Germany and was unable to afford it, which is why he ended up at Johns Hopkins. But Hurdy later did spend the year studying in Germany a little later in his career. Petrie never made it abroad, so he was not able to do that. None of Petrie's students ever went abroad either, but just leaving the South for Petrie's students was like going abroad because most of them had never been very far, and so they would go to study at places like the University of Chicago and Columbia, and they would send Petrie back letters that were filled with awe and confusion and disdain for the things that they witnessed in the big city. So it was like going out of the country for many of his students when they went to Columbia and Chicago and Harvard and Stanford.
Dr. Bruin also recruited Dr. Charles Carey to come to Auburn, and he had two caveats before he would come. One, he was on his way to Germany to study under Coate, and then going to France to study under Pasteur, and then he wanted to be able to continue his research when he came to Auburn. So Bruin was a pretty forward-thinking.
William Leroy Brown was really the man who recruited all of the giants of Auburn history to the faculty. If you look around campus and town today and you see names like Mell and Thatch and Carey and Petrie, all of the giants of Auburn history almost were recruited to the Auburn faculty by William Leroy Brown, who probably doesn't get nearly as much credit as he deserves as one of Auburn's great presidents.
My father was a poor farm boy and graduated good old Auburn in 1915. He and my mother in Alabama moved to Mississippi, and we had 4 girls. The 3 older had graduated here, then I came the youngest. And we were trained with my roommate. We wanted to study veterinary medicine from Mississippi. We had on hats and gloves. This is just funny stuff to tell you. Okay, my daddy, wanting to look after me, wrote down people I could call on if I needed any help. One was Dr. Petrie. I never did need any help, but the other thing was I joined Baptist Church with Baptists, but I visited other churches, and I visited the Presbyterian Church here before is the one down now, which later on the husband built that, John Connor Construction. But I was in the balcony, and I looked down and I saw George Petrie, and I said, "Who does Dr. Petrie?" That's the one my father said I could call on. That's the end of the story.
Well, I'm sure a lot of students were sent to Auburn with the instructions to call Dr. Petrie if they got in trouble. And he spent a lot of his time getting people out of trouble.
That wasn't what my daddy had in mind.
Was there any more? Yeah.
We know that Cliff Hare was on that first team, and in your book, but he wasn't on the starting team, and so you mentioned the starting group that got on the field first. He wasn't in that group. Number one, what position did he play? And secondly, if he wasn't even that good of a player, why do we name the stadium that?
Well, that's a good question. You know, there would be a pretty good argument for naming the stadium after Dr. Petrie, and there was some sentiment when the stadium was built in the late 30s to name the stadium after Petrie, and he actually made the dedication address at the stadium when they played that first game against Florida in 1939 when the stadium was dedicated. And in the end, all that Petrie had named for him was the field house, which was Petrie Hall, which is almost forgotten today and is probably doomed to become a parking lot if recent Auburn history is any indication. That would be a real shame because that's the only building here named for Petrie. Cliff Hare, yes?
There's a street name for it.
Well, there's a street named for him, but the only campus building, of course, and then there's a dorm named for Mary Lane Petrie. So his wife also has a building named that's not as likely to become a parking lot, hopefully. Cliff Hare was a lineman on that first football team, and the reason that Cliff Hare had the stadium named after him is he became an athletic administrator. Later on, an athletic director, and was involved in athletic administration, and that's why the stadium was named after him, not for any of his football exploits.
Okay.
Mike, I want to remind people that copies of the book are available for sale and for signature, and that when we finish their refreshments in the room behind the rooms.
Yes, and authors only get paid once a year, so please remember that when you're on your way out. Historical research is not free. Okay, I'll assume there's no more questions. I appreciate you coming today. I really enjoyed talking about Petrie. If you have any more questions, please stay and ask me. He was an amazing fellow. Thanks.